Hello everyone, welcome to the week 3 lecture for EMS207 2025-30 session. So we've got a few pretty important areas to cover in this week. Last week we covered the syllabus, which is really the foundational element of the subject. This week we're looking at unit planning and the 5 E's. My thought is if I can get you squared away with the 5 E's in the syllabus, you're probably going to be travelling pretty well in the subject. So these are really the foundational components. If you can get a grasp of these, you're probably going to track pretty well and have pretty good instincts, even if the finer details elude you in some areas. I still think the remaining lectures are pretty important, particularly with regard to instructional approaches. But if you're sticking with me this week, hopefully we can get you to a pretty comfortable spot in the subject. So let's move through some of these elements. An important note that I'd like to point to in case you're intending to engage with Scoodle, and I'd recommend engaging with Scoodle because it's a nationally recognised website that allows you to log in and actually get resources aligned with the syllabus, so you can brainstorm and find stuff for science syllabi and all those sorts of things. You can see here, you can look at sort of the early science stuff, you can filter by year level and cross-curricular capabilities and all sorts of things. And it is aligned with the national syllabus. Highly worth engaging with this because you are quite welcome to use these and develop these with proper citation. But the way to get an account is to use your CSU username at postoffice.csu.edu.au. This will actually filter to the email address that you already automatically have with CSU, but this is how you can access it and make sure you have an education password. So I highly recommend you spend some time familiarising yourself with Scoodle. Definitely worth a bookmark, not just for science, but for all your endeavours as an educator. So let's get into some unit planning sort of stuff here as well. So generally speaking, there are many different planning documents that can emerge in a school setting, and the structure and content and detail of those documents can vary like anything else. So we're not showing you the industry standard here. That's not reasonable. Our purpose here is to get you to produce something that will enable us to assess your learning against the outcomes in this subject of EMS207. So in some respects, we're going to be asking for more detail than a teacher would be expected to provide. And I hope you can understand why that is, because we need to give you that big rubber stamp of approval to say that you get to do what teachers do. Okay? So at a school level, a scope and sequence summarises what is to be taught and the sequence in which it will be taught. So at university, we see this in course design, where, which subjects fall where. How does EMS207 prepare students for later subjects? Does it build upon earlier subjects? Those sorts of things. So they start to give us a sense of progress across stage levels and things like that. And the elements of a scope and sequence generally include, particularly if you've got one at a unit level for a particular subject in a particular stage level in class, you'd have a title, you have a sequence, you would have a duration, and the syllabus linkages. So it's usually the broadest possible array of information. We've asked for a bit more in this subject, but it's that real bird's eye view. It gives us a sense of where we're headed, but it doesn't get into the weeds of how you're doing it in a lesson plan style. Which questions are being asked, what the resources are. But they're important to make sure there aren't gaps in the sequence. So we need to see the forest and the trees at different points, I guess is what I would say. We need to talk again about outcomes-based versus traditional practice. And if you can internalise this information, that is the first step in stepping away from the kinds of thoughts that people have about education that are not correct. So if we look on the left here to traditional practice, this is often what we see when non-educators try to teach. They may be talented, they may know a lot, they may have some good strategies of their own. But because they're not engaged in a profession, they tend to go about things this way. They start as they mean to teach. So they think, well, I better start with my teaching, then think about the assessment, and then, gosh, I hope that meets the outcomes. So they often design activities, and they look on Instagram, they check out cool things, they find fun activities. They can be completely random. I've seen this happen at the university level. I've seen it happen in undergrads. The worst scenario is where you end up bringing American activities with that don't use the metric system into activities. You design an assessment, you think, okay, well, I did that stuff, let me assess that stuff. Usually, do a little quiz at the end or something. Pretty basic, a post-test. You give a bit of feedback on that test and boom, we're on to the next topic. You've probably seen that quite a lot. You've probably seen it at university. You've probably had it in high school yourself. It is the design process reflecting the teaching process. The frustrating part about this is it kind of makes sense, but it's not the most effective way to do things. So instead of starting where we start teaching, we should start where we mean the students to end. So the one on the right here, outcomes-based practice, is what we want to move through. This is the process that all educators should move through at any level. So the first thing that we do, whether we're teaching in higher education all the way through to early stage 1, is we select the outcomes, concepts and processes that students need to know. So why are they there? What are they trying to learn? What do you need to teach them as a professional? Fair question. You can't just do anything. I can't walk into a tutorial room and start, sometimes I do it by accident, but derail it with topics that I like, but you're not paying to be there to learn the things that I like. You're paying to meet certain outcomes, as Nice has indicated in the subject outline. So once we've determined what those outcomes are, and I actually find it really helpful, it still drives me nuts up here. There are rubrics where they talk about spelling errors and stuff like that, and you're graded on spelling errors. Fine, satisfactory, unsatisfactory, but we're here for certain content points, which is what we want to focus on. We then design assessment through which students will have an opportunity to demonstrate those things. So here's the verb and the noun, whatever we say, and then what does that look like in my classroom, in my tutorial? Is it online? Is it face-to-face? What will those people be doing, showing, producing? There's lots of room in that. We're talking about creative arts. You could do performance-based stuff. You could do interactive oral assessment. You could have people make a poster. You could have people make a movie. You could have them do a written report or an essay. Lots of reasons to make different decisions. Could be a group assignment. Then you decide, well, if they're to succeed in this assessment task, and I want them to succeed, of course you do. That's your job. What learning activities will they need to learn the things they need for the assessment? So if we look at, we can probably already see this in the lectures. We know for this subject, if you were to do a unit outline, you need to know the syllabus. You need to know the 5 E's. You probably notice that a lot of things I'm talking about are in the subject assessment task and the rubric. That's because we're using outcomes-based or backwards mapped assessment. We then plan instruction to assure that each student has an adequate opportunity to learn the skills they need for the assessment. It is not fair for any student in a summative sense to be assessed on things they have not been taught or have the opportunity to develop. That's black box assessment. That's guess what's in the lecturer or the teacher's head, and it's no good. And then what we want to do is use data from the assessment to give feedback, reteach, and or move to the next level. And ideally influence our work as educators, where we go, oh God, everyone failed on this thing, I better fix that. I've done it heaps of times. When I teach research subjects, first thing I noticed when the first time I taught it, no one could write a research question. And then it hit me, sadly, like a ton of bricks. I didn't teach this very well. And so I had to go cap in hand and fix it. And I did. So that's what we want. We don't just give feedback and go, oh, there's your mark, credit, move on. The whole thing needs the feedback that we gain through this backward map process, feeds into the teaching in the future, it feeds into the students' performance in the future, and it feeds to the next assessment in that cycle, assessment 1 to assessment 2. So the unit planning process tends to look a bit like this. We have these driving questions, these outcomes that we're moving towards, and we have this process of assessment, background knowledge, outcomes and indicators, learning sequence, and they are interrelated. It is not a line, a straight line, it is a cycle that we engage with. Here are some example scope and sequence documents. Now, you can have a look at these. Don't look at them as example assessment tasks, because these are not aligned to the rubric for this assessment subject, but they give you a sense of what you might see in a school. So note there's less detail. We've got the subject outcome codes sitting there. There's no great detail. This is giving us a unit overview of science throughout an entire year. 10 weeks here, 10 weeks here, 6 weeks here, 10 weeks here. It's the bird's eye picture that the teacher and the principal are using to make sure that all the outcomes they need are being addressed appropriately. You cannot teach, experienced teachers can probably just teach off this. but this would not be sufficient for your assessment task in this subject. But have a look and see where you might be headed in the profession, because guess what? We're not chasing. Once you go through this process, you can start using things like day books and planners, but we need to see lesson plans at this level because we need to make sure you're meeting the standards to enter the profession. So don't get upset when you go, but my teacher does this. And I go, yeah, they've got their degree. They may be accredited. They may be proficient. They may be, a lead teacher. So again, select the outcomes, design the assessment, decide what they need, what learning opportunities they need, what they need to know to do the assessment, and then plan instruction to meet those needs. That's how this process works. Been through that a few times. Yeah, so we think about the assessment up front, and that ensures appropriate alignment. Once we start moving away from this, we end up with waste and relics and stuff that we think is fun but actually isn't relevant, and it helps to remove our own little biases, our own little sense of fun, things we like but are no longer relevant to what students are required to learn. So it keeps us honest in a way. So we build, anyway, there's another example of it. So another simple way of looking at it is that we start with the desired results, we ask ourselves what the evidence of those results might be, and we provide learning activities so that students are capable of providing us with that evidence. There you go, you can print that one out, stick it on your wall. So it's a funny old way of thinking. So we usually ask ourselves, look, what are the big ideas? What are the goals? What are we getting at here? What's the point of this? Geez, I ask myself this a lot in different contexts, to be quite honest. And then we say, okay, how are we getting towards this big idea? What are we going to see? What's the evidence? I want the students to produce a PowerPoint presentation. I want them to make a video. But in that video, they've got to show knowledge of the difference between living and non-living things, whatever it may be. And then I say, well, I'm going to need lessons on all these skills. They're going to need to learn to make videos. They're going to need to learn to work together. They're going to learn what the difference between living and non-living things are. They're going to need to learn how to categorise, how to create a system of classification. They're going to look at old systems of classification, new systems of classification, whatever it may be. If you are looking for some information on big ideas for your unit, I've come across some stuff, and there's an article I wrote, when did I write this? I can't remember, 2 years ago, about the big ideas. And I actually went and analysed the big ideas that primary teachers talked about in their practice. I can't remember how many, anyway, you can look at the article yourself. You can cite it as evidence of scholarly engagement in Assessment 2's report if you would like to do so. But you might not be using big ideas. But I wanted to point to some of these because they're really useful. These are, in Harlan's estimation, the big ideas of science content knowledge. And these are the sort of things that can give us a guiding framework, regardless of what we're teaching in, where we're teaching, what year level, where we exist. We can ask ourselves if what we're teaching contributes in some way to this, to know if we're on the right track. All objects in the universe are made of very small, all matter in the universe is made of very small particles. Objects can affect other objects at a distance. Our solar system is a very small part of billions of galaxies in the universe. Very simple ideas. We might take them for granted as adults. Organisms are organised on a cellular basis and have finite lifespans. The diversity of organisms living and extinct is the result of evolution. Core ideas. I like these ones as well, quite a lot. Science is about finding the cause of causes of phenomena in the real world. Scientific explanations, theories, and models are those that best fit the evidence available at a particular time. It is not immutable truth. The knowledge produced by science is used in engineering technologies to create products to serve human ends. I love this because it cuts through all my waffle. And the applications of science often have ethical, social, economic, and political implications. So this, we can already see aligns with the Australian syllabus. And you might have some of these or alter some of these to suit what you're doing in your units. You might simplify them, it might be a part of it, but Harlan could be something to explore as you engage in your design. I wanted to point to this one. And I didn't say this. I asked a teacher, as part of a research project, what she thought the big ideas of science were. She had no prompt, there were no frameworks, nothing, off the top of her head. And I think this interview occurred in the afternoon, so she's come off class, probably tired, and she drops this. She gave 8 of the 10 big ideas of science in 129 words, and it was brilliant. And it's evidence to me of why, A, the depth of this profession, and B, why teachers who have been trained and been experienced for a while get that extra trust. If she can do that in 129 words with no prep, I think you guys can head towards similar stuff by dedicating yourself to your careers. But I mean, this one, everything consists of matter, smallest particle is an atom, and there are three main states of matter. Properties of materials can affect how they are used and behave. Different forces can act of objects, causing them to move, speed up or slow down. Energy can be changed in many forms, including light, sound, heat, but total amount stays the same. Conservation of energy. Living things are diverse and have complex relationship with other living things and the world they live in. Each organism has specific characteristics and needs, and they have changed and are through evolution. Our solar system is a small part of a bigger universe and is made up of very different planets, stars and other things. Our Earth is a changing planet shaped by human activity and climate. Brilliant. Absolutely brilliant. And occurred before the age of AI as well when she produced this. So I really like that as a framing element. Something to strive for. Just incredible quote. Moving on here, so how you'll find this, I mean, there's a program tool here that you can look at if you're interested. There's advice on the New South Wales Education, the NISA website, if you'd like to look at it. But you'll see here many of the same themes that I've talked about are represented here. So it is not to say all assessment needs to be a formal test, that it actually should reflect the needs, interests and abilities of students. So boy, don't teachers have a lot of discretion and pressure and responsibility there to make that work. Include a variety of different assessment strategies. So, hold on for week 6, are flexible and dynamic documents that change in response. So this is the other thing. This assessment task is inherently inauthentic. The ones we're doing in this subject are inauthentic because you don't have a class in front of you. So really, this is your best guess, your perfect world scenario. And we do acknowledge that. They include adjustments. They reflect school and sector priorities, values and initiatives. So if STEM starts to become a big thing, and I hope it does, you might do more STEM. And of course, importantly, are a record of how syllabus requirements are met. So there's an accountability aspect to this as well. So even the advice here, I think does align with what we're saying in this subject, which is nice. It's important. It's good, at least good that we're not completely out of sync. So what are some approaches to unit planning? We've talked about, this sort of backward mapping, outcomes-based assessment. That's a core thing. You can't move away from that. But how might that be expressed? A few different things. We can have backward fated scaffolding to complement our backward mapping. So this idea that not only are we've started from where we intend to go, that over time, as the learning sequencing occurs through lessons, units, so it can occur at a macro level, across early stage 1 to stage 3, and it'll occur at a micro level through a unit over a course of 12 weeks. But the idea is, over time, the teacher's control diminishes and the student's control and agency expands. So in lesson plans, I generally expect to see less teacher says, teacher does over the course of the lesson, more student does. It doesn't say one changes and one day the teacher disappears. But eventually the teacher's sort of at the side answering questions. But we still acknowledge that the teacher has to impart information, set parameters, answer questions. Lecture, dare I say, give out a worksheet, show a video. The idea that the student-centred and the teacher-centred are part of this process, that direct instruction and student-centred learning are not at odds with one another. I quite like this. I mean, it's actually based on what this subject's based on. You might remember week 1, full on. If you're in Bathurst, it's me talking and you talk for a bit and then I talk and then talk again and then you talk. But eventually this opens up. And by the time week 11 or 12 rolls around, I will be completely unnecessary. It's my favourite part of the entire semester where I go, they're saying the things that I would say. And it happens every semester for me. Eventually someone's getting feedback from a peer and they say exactly what I would have said and I go, well, my job is done. So we plan ahead and anticipate errors with this one, with backward fated scaffolding. We go, this might be confusing. This is what we know about learning. We have to be mindful of this. And we can do this from diagnostic assessment or our own research, which is what you'll do in this subject. You define a common task for a common goal. Again, this idea of creating a unit together. You model learning skill, provide appropriate dialogue and interact. So the idea is you model, guide, and then they do it individually. Often this guiding process occurs through things like joint construction, where we're working together and the expert is verbalising the processes that they go through cognitively. We sequence events in a step-by-step approach, and we provide cues, questions, and hints to help the students reach that goal without spoon-feeding them. So there's a lot of annoying questions like, what about, what if, why? Can you justify that for me? Not yes, no, do this thing. So we don't want to spoon-feed, and usually those questions are open-ended. Or reframing questions where we're helping develop language, which is another thing I'll talk about. So backward-faded scaffolding usually leads us to this idea where we step back and observe and decide how much support students need, and we often fade and transfer responsibility. But this is not permanent. It changes from lesson to lesson to lesson. This is not to say, oh yeah, they're in year 6, I'm finished now, they don't need me. Of course they do. Of course they do. The way they need you changes. And you have to respond to that. Which is sometimes in a tutorial setting, the wheels can fall off in week 6 and we're back to lecture town. You respond to the needs of your learners always. And you include diagnostic and formative assessment to adapt to challenges and needs, and may I say opportunities as well. So this idea that we're constantly searching for data to make sure that how we're balancing the scaffolding and removing it is appropriate. Because if we go too fast, if we just threw you into groups and said, off you go, with 2 seconds of prep in week 1, it wouldn't have worked. You would have been extremely angry and frustrated with us. So the funny thing is, basically the way all this works is that the planning phase is the complete inverse of the teaching phase. We have our outcome, we determine acceptable evidence, we determine what they need to show us that evidence, and we help them get there through lessons and activities. And then we go through the activities, they develop the skills, they show us the evidence, and they met the outcomes. That's the model. So let's unpack how this might actually work in a practical setting. So let's just use an example. Living World Stage 1. A good old-fashioned favourite. Everyone likes Living World. Although it can be hard to do lots of fun investigations with. Every strand has its own strengths and weaknesses. But we can see here, we've got that grouped kind of components together. We've got these observes, questions, collects data from Stage 1. So ages 6 and 7, years 1 and 2. Uses materials, tools and equipment to develop solutions for a need or opportunity. So digital, physical, we can already start to see some opportunities here. But they do need to describe observable features of living things and their environment. Whether this is a book, whether they're going somewhere, whether they're taking pictures, what data they're collecting, well, that's up to you, or me in this case. And identifies how plants and animals are used for food, fibre and products. So we can start to look at the content a bit here as well. So they need to describe external features of a variety of living things. The neat thing here is you can adjust this to suit those students. It doesn't say which ones. We would look at jellyfish if we wanted to. We could look at some really tricky ones if those students need advancement. But they've got some examples here. Identifying group animals and plants based on their features. For example, notice it's for example. It is not a directive, it is a suggestion. You can use those, you can add them, you can find specifics. Native and introduced plants and animals. Worms, insects, fish, reptiles, etc. So my evidence, what might this look like? This is just me brainstorming, not really developed. I could have them do a class presentation. That's probably not a bad idea. Pretty classic, we've all done that. We could have them do a model. Create a zoo for me. I could probably have my son produce something in Minecraft. Right? Actually, you could do that too. Minecraft education exists for a reason. Although you may choose not to bring Minecraft in, your school might not have the resources. But in the assessment of this subject, your school is perfect, within reason. You could do a report for a zoo. We could have a scenario where you're the chief zoo purchaser and you must determine what way we should develop the zoo or blah, blah, blah. You get the picture. So then we start thinking, okay, well, if that's my assessment, one of those three, what skills and knowledge are they going to need to do that assessment? Well, I know from those outcomes that they're going to need to know what the external features of living things are. So fortunately, we don't need to dissect them. We're going to need to know about, fur, skin, legs, abdomens, all those sorts of things. We're going to need to help them develop that language through the 5 E's. We're going to need to know about plants and animals, flora and fauna. We're going to need to learn how to do structured observation. So sitting there and taking notes and maybe doing a worksheet, an observation checklist to categorise different elements. And we're probably going to have to work through that with them. We're going to have to model that too, I would say. We're going to have to learn about different systems of classifications. Now, they could create their own, but we're probably going to have to show them some as well and model that process. In terms of the skills, they're going to need to know how to conduct field work. They probably need to know how to use their iPads, to go outside to draw, to work in groups, to use magnifying glasses, whatever you think. They're going to need to know how to evaluate a classification system. They're going to need to understand that my favourite animals is not a particularly replicable system or justifiable one, and that maybe vertebrates, invertebrates are a bit easier, or mammals, monotremes, those sorts of things, lizards, reptiles, what the differences are, plants and animals, etc. They're going to need to know how to present information, so they're going to have some English skills. They're probably going to have to know how to compose text, maybe some digital technology skills as well. Like Canva. My son loves Canva, uses it all the time. He's in year 1. Or actually about to enter year 2. And creating classification systems, way more complicated. So they're going to need a lot. I mean, even just this brief breakdown tells us that there's a lot going into this process. So you need to make choices because you can't do everything. So here's my rough thing. I need these skills. What am I going to need to do? Look, I'm going to do a recap of living and non-living things from early stage 1. Fair cop, not a bad idea. Why not? Just to check. Bit of diagnostic assessment. I might do an excursion or explore the school grounds. Gosh, it's boring. So boring. But I can make that interesting. I can tell them what we're doing. We can have a big question. I can give them group role cards. I can give them technologies to use. We can maybe jointly create a method or a protocol or a rule set for how we're going to find this. Are different groups going to have different sections of the school? I don't know. That's your choice. We could do video or an in-school guest. I don't know. Depends on what your school's got around. Maybe you know someone. We could do class chickens. I love this one. We've seen this from time to time. Schools start to move towards this. If we can do that, we can give that one a go. But hey, you might not be in a position to do that. You might be too burnt out and to have too much going on in your life, so you move away from that. Fair enough. We can look at testing the conditions for plant life, perhaps, in a basic way. A bit of plant growing sort of stuff. We can discuss classification. We can have question prompts that we need. Is good or bad tricky? Is something good or bad? Too subjective. We should all be able to get the same answer. Does it have eyes? Does it move? So we can look at different forms of classification. They need to know how to use PowerPoint or Canva or something. Do we want AI in this? I don't know. I haven't thought about it. Constructing a data collection table or a picto chart. Trialing other people's classification system and giving feedback. That could be a way to evaluate classification systems and create them. And suddenly we start to see a unit take shape. But we can do this for other ones as well. I won't do them now, but that's just me taking you through the process. You can check out more about sort of the PCK elements that play a role in all of this. We've been through them in tutorials, so I won't go through them all right now. And I can sense this is already going to run a little bit long, this particular lecture, so bear with me. Another approach that you might use in service of outcomes-based or backward-mapped assessment is the idea of a bottom-up approach. So this is how we're organising the ideas. So it might be, and you probably saw some of this with what I just said, we start with the most basic ideas and move to the most complex ideas. It's already in the syllabus. They don't think about environments and system thinking too much until they know what living and non-living things are. And that's pretty reasonable, I think. The example here is a student needs to know what a living thing is before they can consider its needs. There's a lot of comparison stuff. And a lot of you will naturally gravitate to bottom-up approaches, justifiably so. But we want to make that connection, the the development of knowledge from more basic to more complex, explicit. Reminders, questions, bringing back data they've collected from previous weeks. We don't make it implicit, we make it as explicit as possible. And ideally what you'd like for them to say is, that's what we did. Actually, it reminds me of what we did last week. Yeah, I can see what you're getting at. Okay? Don't just assume it will work, but that's a pretty safe and sturdy approach. It can be reflected in a unit, and guess what? It's also reflected in the syllabus at a macro level, moving between levels, stage levels. So we can actually see generally, things like excursions, HSLE, PHPE tend to focus at a very student, personal focus level. Kindergarten tends to be focused on the self and the family. It then moves into the sort of local. We then think about regional, national, and global issues in sequence. So we're not generally talking about the United Nations to kindergarten kids, for example. So we see this theme of bottom-up everywhere. I think you see it at uni, ideally, as well. The idea should be that a master's program is more complicated than a bachelor's program, more complicated than high school. So it's a safe one for a reason. Build foundational skills development. So they engage students, and look, honestly, syllabus tends to naturally align with that. So you're not punished for doing it. You can do a great job with this. Simple is not bad. You do a top-down approach. Doesn't suit everything. You throw the whole thing on its head. This is where students are often introduced to a full phenomenon, something in its full complexity, the entire system at play, a city, an ecosystem, a solar system. And the way the unit is about breaking that big complex idea into its composite parts, like computational thinking. An example might be we're looking at the solar system and different groups are going to look at different planets and we're going to report back. This doesn't suit everything, but there are advantages to this because it naturally taps into systems thinking and gives it a sense of complexity and exposes them to a full phenomenon, I should say. Another one is problem-based learning. I do want to say these aren't necessarily mutually exclusive things. You can incorporate, different versions. You could mix and match these. You could have a bottom-up approach that leads towards a problem-based learning scenario, but play around with it. This is where a problem or issue is central to the learning process. I mean, the classic, like the principal's got a problem. I mean, my wife did one years ago where there was a pretend flooding issue where she wanted to do a waterworks unit. And there was this big pretend thing where the groundskeeper had flooded the school or something. It was all made up. And they had to work out how to conserve water. The funny thing was the kids thought that this was real. They went and, anyway. But, creating a big problem to solve. It's a nice way to go about it, very effectively used in literature as well. So you might provide a fictional scenario. Our town is opening a wilderness enclosure and, some people are protesting it, whatever it is, as a means of progressing learning through the unit. So we're still doing those lessons, but they're tying into this problem, okay? And it tends to tie nicely into the assessment and it gives students a sense of purpose and coherence. On a small level, a problem-based learning scenario can simply be inquiry questions, and you can have several in a unit. You can have one in a unit. It's up to you. The scale of it is up to you. And the other one that we should think about is the spiral curriculum. And this is the idea that themes do not occur once and that we never touch them again. And so I often see this in unit planning where group members go, look, but I'm doing this living thing, or I'm doing heat, or I'm doing light or something. Wow, this person can't do it. And I would say, well, look, sentences you just learn about full stops and capital letters in one day and you never touch them again. Of course not. You don't want to repeat lessons, but themes should be developed. So, yes, while someone may do living things and look at mammals, for example, the next lesson may include mammals as compared to reptiles, and it develops the learning. So if the verbs are going higher and more things are being brought in, you're generally moving it along and not repeating the lesson. So the idea with the spiral design is you never truly abandon a topic or a theme. It comes back in increasingly more complexity over time. It's a bit like saying if I turn my head 90 degrees from the computer screen now, I'm looking at a bookshelf, but I can still see the computer screen out the corner of my eye. It is not in isolation. So that could be something to think about, that I acknowledge prior learning and actually bring those themes into later lessons and signal ahead to future lessons. Really good for coherence. So don't think it just has to be one and done. We can bring ideas back and develop them. And in fact, I think depth is better than breadth in this subject. So a spiral curriculum can be defined as a course of study in which students will see the same topics throughout their school career, with each encounter increasing in complexity and reinforcing previous learning. I do writing development with research students. Writing development that begins in kindergarten, probably earlier for many. We're still revisiting, developing, refining, doing all these sorts of things. And generally these topics move from simple to complex. So moving from recall to evaluate to create sort of stuff. And again, you can see that in the same way we talked about the sort of levels of focus. This is reflected broadly in the curriculum as well, because we're not starting with full report writing in kindergarten. If you put in evidence of a spiral curriculum, it will strengthen your scope and sequence. If I see stuff and we see stuff like, these data that they collected in lesson 1, we're going to bring them back and we're going to put them on a Venn diagram and we're going to, that sort of stuff. If it is explicit, that starts to strengthen the quality of a group component and probably individual lessons as well. There are weaker approaches. Task first. I've got this really fun idea. We're going to do this thing and we're just going to kind of hope it fits the syllabus, right? We're going to build this thing. It might work, but you're probably going to do a bunch of stuff that doesn't quite fit, or you'll find the mathematics is a bit complicated, or whatever it may be. It can work, but its risk of failure is higher if you just go, this fun task that I've picked and I've seen on YouTube, great. It might work, but your risk is high. Categorical thematic shift. This is where learning progression is briefly stalled as themes are changed. So we're not advancing the learning or moving the cognitive load up, but it could be a case where you're repeating more or less the same research tasks with different products. So we go, here's a lesson on butterflies, here's a lesson on cats and dogs, here's a lesson on, water beetles or something. But the structure of the lesson never changes. It's still teacher-centered. There's no comparison. We're not requiring different skills. The assessment doesn't advance. It's not to say it's wrong necessarily, but it can just lead to a lot of treading water. And categorical shift can be identified when there are no clear connections between the prior lessons. They might as well be separate episodes of the show. Having this happen in your unit across 12 lessons and 4 people will happen. So a little bit of it's okay. You know, the first 2 people might work really well together and the third person just kind of jumps off somewhere else. Fine. You can still do quite well with that. But we want to minimise it. We want to have as much coherence as we can. So we expect to see some of it. I mean, geez, I have some of it. Experienced teachers do. We're not perfect. But ideally, these changes in theme should be accompanied by more complex pedagogies and more complex skill development to minimise it. So that there's something happening. They're building on skills they're developing, even if the knowledge seems to just be a thematic shift. Now, let us talk for a brief period of time, hopefully, and I've been on this for a little while, about the 5 E's instructional model. And I'll take you through the basics of it. Please pay close attention because we will be going through this in the tutorials. So the 5 E's works through 5 discrete phases that cannot be skipped, merged or reordered. So they can't become a replacement for intro, body, conclusion. You can double them, so you could go 2 engage phases, an explore phase and explain phase, but you could not reorder, skip or merge them. And if we see this in the assessment task, that will be an indicator that people haven't engaged appropriately with the materials. So let's go through them in sequence. In your unit, you could restart the sequence after completing it. You could do it in a couple of lessons. I mean, 1 lesson would be stretching it, but it's possible for the sake of the assessment task. Or you could do 1 lesson for 1 particular phase. My advice would be in your 3 lessons to try and work through at least 1 cycle of the 5 E's, just to use the different pedagogies. But the decisions there can be negotiated and discussed in tutorials. So let's start with the 5 E's. You can find more about it in the Scamp & Preston 2017 text. It's in the later versions as well, the 7th and the 8th, if you'd like more information. You can see there's the 7th version and some applications across different areas there as well. So the engage phase really achieves 2 things. It is there to capture interest and engagement of students. This is where you might connect to their real world experiences. Or provide some sort of exciting video or kind of some crazy scenario or something like that. So it's there to get eyes on you and then engage in the task itself. So it's to promote curiosity, raise questions for inquiry. You might have an idea about what the inquiry question might be, but you might have some input from the students as well. The other key focus, aside from sparking interest, is of course to elicit students' existing ideas or to engage in diagnostic assessment. That can be very simple, it can be complex, but it's to get a baseline sense of what these students are bringing into the lesson, the set of lessons or the unit itself. So the scale of it, again, it can be negotiated. So you can see an example here of a very simple but a tried and true kind of idea where the students are coming into the engage phase doing a annotated diagram and using their own language. You can see non-scientific language here like stretchy material. So they're not using a term like elastic at this stage, but that's the diagnostic process here. It's not expected that the students will have the answers, but we want that information so we can attach that and incorporate that into the learning and to show their growth later on as well. So it's a great way to get artifacts. You could use this to start some sort of portfolio process. You can show a video, an explosion, an experiment. So this is where you can be very teacher-centered in a sense, but you can engage them in the process in a way too. It can be very obtuse. It could have like a problem element. Like I used to do things like try and get students to get what was one of the challenges I used to use? Like an open challenge or something like that, where you could try and see if you could get them to move water with a balloon without the balloon touching the water. So looking at static electricity charges, all sorts of stuff. Get them to, So there's all sorts of little bits and pieces. So you can be entertaining here. So a few little ideas. Again, this is an exhaustive list. You can get them to discuss their prior experiences and ideas with their peers. I think, pair, share kind of thing. You can bring in alternative media sources here like YouTube or website or whatever you think is appropriate. You can bring in diagnostic assessments here. This can be work samples, it can be drawings, it can be class discussions, it can be a worksheet if you so desire. A good one that we often see is a KWL chart established here to kind of link this to future assessment. So you could say what we know, what we want to know, and what we've learned. Now, you can adapt this to say things like TKWL chart, like what we think we know, what we know, what we want to know and what we've learned, or you can add a H in there as well and say what we know, how we know it, and stuff like that. So you can play around with the structure of this, is what I'm saying. Once you've captured interest and done a bit of diagnostic assessment, we engage in the explore phase. So this is where students explore ideas, collect evidence, discuss observations, keep records. So they are typically engaging in working scientifically or design and production here. The key thing is, though, it's typically not a fixed element. It's usually more open, an open sort of process. It's more about a sensory experience. They're often engaging with their senses, and there's often, you probing them aside, saying, what does that feel like? What does that sound like? How many? How much? And so it's a skill development idea in an open sort of setting, often a naturalist one. But the key thing here is they're moving through this openly. They're not expected to have a scientific understanding at this point. They're still using their own language largely in how they're describing things. They're developing skills, taking pictures, making their own observations, usually perhaps a predict, observe, explain type of thing, articulating what they think is happening, really emphasising their own language and thoughts. The key thing here is the students are having a shared experience for later learning. So you're not relying on something happening in the past. You're developing that together. So, we might see students go for a walk around the school grounds, for example, or go through a bunch of stations where they're looking at materials with different properties and writing down what they're seeing and observing. Non-Newtonian fluids, water, plastic, Play-Doh, slinkies, all that sort of stuff. So it's open-ended, I guess, is the way to describe this. It's typically hands-on. Doesn't have to be, but often hands-on. At the very least, student-centered. Their experiences, they're collecting data, and that idea of data is very open-ended. It can be counting, describing, audio recordings, taking pictures, any way of expressing an idea. And in fact, I think the richer it is, visual, auditory, those sorts of things, writing can be a part of it as well. The more varied this is, the better. Ideally, though, you're trying to create this shared experience with lots of rich data points if possible, so that they can begin to explain that in the next phase with your help. So, here are some examples. These are some students playing around with non-Newtonian fluid. What properties does this have? Is it a solid or liquid? That sort of stuff. What does it look like, smell like, sound like? And you can see the old Bush's paper in the background really tapping into this. So what are some exploration ideas? Hands-on activities are great. Students explore ideas, collect evidence, discuss their observations, keep records in a journal. But it's not about it being right. It's about it being consistent and engaging in that process. You could do surveys, open-ended questions. It really depends on the topic, ultimately. Once you've engaged in that, they move on to the explain phase. Now, the key thing here is this is where students construct explanations to clarify their understandings. So it is not the teacher explaining to the students, this is what just happened. It is the students, with the support of the teacher, explaining what has happened. So often they're taking the more informal language, like stretching, and it's being developed through teacher prompts, questions, and clarifications to say, well, that's a good example of elasticity, or something of high elasticity, for example. So usually they introduce their own words, and the teacher, through questioning and reframing, is helping them to strengthen that scientific language in their explanations. The teacher can correct, they can clarify, but it needs to be a dialogic process, is the point that I would make here. So this involves discussion of students' experiences and observations. The teacher typically takes a lead in this, making sure it stays on track, drawing connections and those sorts of things, and using science concepts to develop explanations of the phenomena. So you typically hear the students develop a literacy product. Presentation, poster, video, written report, whatever, worksheet, whatever you like, but a product for the formative assessment component of this thing. So whatever representation you like, a diagram, I mean, it's so many options here. This is where your creative arts can come into it, for example. The representations here enable the teacher to monitor developing understanding and provide feedback to learners. They explain, not you, is the long and short of it here. So you can see the old classic example. They've got a poster, they're taking questions, they're talking about it. Some questions come from teachers, some come from their peers, whatever you like. It can, of course, be a worksheet. Here's a great one from Primary Connections, where they're saying this is what it's made out of. Why did you make that choice? So there's a bit of justification here, and they're using their own language and really focusing on it. So a worksheet's a literacy product. Fine. Again, there's nothing wrong with the worksheet. They can self-reflect on some of this sort of stuff and do role-playing exercises. So you can go 3-step interview where one person interviews, one person is being interviewed and one person's recording. You can do role play. For example, a newspaper reporter interviews shoppers and a shop decides to not give out plastic bags. So again, a bit of a dated reference there. But you could do things like plus minus interesting tables about plastic. So, like you could build on a KWL chart or a TKWL chart or a TKWHL chart. We'll go into those in more detail in future weeks, but there are many ways to do detailed, simple self-reflection, reflecting on content, lots of opportunities for explanation. As you can tell, I like to talk, and a lot of people like to talk and describe as well. So do not explain anything yourself unless it is in response to a student. So you respond as much as they give you, so you put in what they put in, basically. Your goal is to respond to their thoughts. You can adapt them, add further clarification, but you don't sit there and explain. They are the ones that instigate. They are the ones that provide the content to start. You can then develop it with your expertise. So you clarify prompts, suggest follow-up actions, use an interactive approach, which is the kind of use of clarifying questions, or phrases like, that's a good example of what if sort of stuff. Because those what ifs and what abouts, those deeper questions, those open questions generally lead to the next phase. So students assume the mantle of expertise here, in a developing sense. Then we move on to the elaborate phase. So there's a nice tightness to those first 3 phases. What do they know? Let's have a shared experience. Let's explain that experience. Then we want to get to the higher phases, those things in the TIMS where we get to 550, where they can apply and expand upon concepts. So this is where they take that concept and apply it in a new way. We move into higher order thinking in this phase, and they start to test that knowledge, and usually through a student-planned investigation or a design and make task. Or a follow-up question like what if, what about, how can we kind of things, where the question moves to be more complicated, extending beyond the classroom perhaps. So students require students to plan and conduct an investigation with a degree of support, of course. That's a judgment that you make through the data that you've collected in that explain phase. And they test and extend the new concept. And so they're developing, interestingly, if the explore phase is introducing some investigative skills, some science skills, they're often developing these and taking more control in the elaborate phase themselves. You're still, of course, supporting and facilitating, never absent. But you can see similar things can happen here. They can, of course, develop written tasks, extended explanations, use more scientifically accurate language. They can develop their own follow-up investigation. So they could, for example, look at testing the absorbency of paper towels. Well, what's the best brand? And we could create an investigation like this where, maybe we count drops or, these sorts of things. This is a classic experiment you do with nappies. How much liquid can they take before they explode? So this is where we often take real-world scenarios, like a project-based scenario could be part of an elaborate phase, a problem-based scenario, some sort of thing where, they're building, the old playground example I use for Material World, those sorts of things where they're building, creating, engaging in higher order thinking stuff. prompts might be what if, what about, why kind of questions. And they can often emerge organically through those first three phases, particularly the explain phase, where they point out wacky observations and stuff. So yes, you'll create some of your own in these assessment tasks, but in practice you might find interesting things in the class to explore and elaborate on yourselves. And then of course we have the evaluate phase. So they've done something pretty sophisticated. If they're conducting an investigation, they're taking more control, they're applying things in a more complex way. We need to find out whether that's been successful. So similar to if the explain phase is some sort of assessment of the explore phase, the evaluate phase is that formal summative assessment of the whole thing. So students represent their understanding. So again, assessment. How you want to do that is up to you. Worksheets, presentations. It's usually a more complex thing than the explain phase. Usually they're doing something more sophisticated. That verb is demanding a little bit more. And they reflect on their learning journey, and the teacher collects evidence, as we must, to help the students to check progress towards the outcomes and to reflect on yourself as a teacher and decide how things might be improved in the future. So again, you could return to a diagram. They could do a draw and label exercise. It doesn't need to be crazy. We can use the traditional stuff and the new stuff as well. You see, this is an example of sort of that return. We saw that sort of that stretchy plastic glove kind of idea, and we can see the same form of assessment coming back here in the evaluate phase, where they're drawing an plastic overcoat but using more scientifically accurate language, where they've played around with that idea of absorbency by testing something like a paper towel. They've done those diagnostic assessments. They've explored stuff through materials, and now they can say the plastic is waterproof and it will keep the water away from the wool, which is absorbent. So you can see that consistent language, the more accurate scientific language, coming to the fore here for the assessment component. So you can ask students to create a literacy product, of course. Why not? You can ask students open-ended questions like the what do you think, what do you know about, how would you explain? That's a good one. Can be a mixture of open and closed-ended if you'd like, but it can't just be a multiple choice quiz. Can't be that. It must have some open-ended component to it. It must have students engage in things like creation, evaluation, justification. It cannot be recall facts, list. It must be higher order for this phase. So they reflect on their learning journey, where they've come from, what skills they've developed. They might get feedback from the teacher themselves or their peers. Doesn't need to be all, but it's something to factor in here. We want a dialogic and rich feedback environment if we can facilitate it. And the teacher can use evidence to assess the extent to which the students have achieved the outcomes. So it is that final summative component for the lesson, the series of lessons, or the unit. The scale is, of course, up to you to determine. If you want to learn more about it, Primary Connections develops units based entirely upon this. There's professional development. The units are free. And you can download examples of things here as well. They're moving towards big ideas there as well, which is quite cool. So they're already playing around with big ideas and doing that sort of stuff. But you can get resources here as well. There are sequences, lessons to look at. They typically go with more what would you call this? A single phase of the E's per lesson, generally. But you can see the classic observation walk here as well happening. It's nicely detailed. You can download the resources and look at examples. So I highly recommend looking at this. You don't have to mirror what they're doing, but you do have to keep them. You can't skip, order, or reorder, or merge the 5Es. But I would they're fantastic people. It's a great starting point. You'll build confidence if you engage with Primary Connections, and then of course you exercise your own judgments. I've been to their professional development. It's accessible. They use basic materials like we would as well. And I think they've probably, if I were to guess, I don't have evidence for it, but I think we can probably have a strong assumption that the recent improvements in primary science in Australia have been led by the Primary Connections guys. 5Es and Primary Connections, of course, are not the only ones you can use. The School Innovation Project that occurred some 20 years ago found kind of 8 components that contribute to strong scientific learning regardless of which framework you apply. So if students are encouraged to actively engage with ideas and evidence, you're probably on the right track. They're challenged to develop meaningful understandings, and we saw that through the 5 E's, particularly as they go from explain to elaborate. If you did intro, body, conclusion, it is quite likely that you would not get into that elaboration component, because that is a explicit structured point. Is linked to students' interests and lives. We saw that with the engage phase as well. Students' individual needs and preferences are catered for to some level or another. We'll talk about that with pedagogies in the future. Assessment is embedded. We saw that. Engage has diagnostic processes. The explain phase has formative, and the evaluate phase has summative. The nature of science is represented in different aspects. We did see that with, particularly the explore and elaborate phases. The classroom is linked to the broader community. This may not occur in every cycle. Clearly, may not occur with every cycle, but there are ways we can do that with different inquiry questions and things like that as well. And learning technologies are exploited for their potentialities. Now, this may be inconsistent, but that's something we in this subject are going to deal with more consistently in the second half of the semester. There are some nice scaffolds to help with this, because we can't just say, oh, we're exploring now. We need to think about structures that can help us to act as facilitators. A couple of my favourites, the claim evidence reasoning framework, could be a worksheet, could be something you say verbally. What claim do you make based on that experience we've had? What is the evidence? And the reasoning is, how do you connect that evidence to the claim? So you need all three, and they're not easy. You can't just say there's the evidence. You go, why is that evidence relevant? That's an important part of this. A simpler one, perhaps for earlier stages, they all have value, but the predictives of explain. What do you think will happen? What happened? Why did that happen? You could do that with sinking and floating. You could do it in the bath with a toddler. And you can do that all the way through the process. You can do that all the way into more advanced science. And there's some great heuristic templates here as well. Beginning questions, tests. Notice here they've got framing elements like what can I see, what can I claim, what do I know? Really nice structured elements that you can work within a lesson, use within a lesson, and then use them consistently throughout a unit. So there are so many rich opportunities. So what are the implications for you as a teacher in all of this? Well, the 5 E's is a cycle that you can use to structure and sequence your lessons. Instead of intro, body, conclusion, you've got engage, explore, explain, elaborate, evaluate. You don't need to have all of them in the lesson. You could have an engage, explore lesson, an explain, elaborate lesson, an evaluate lesson. It's up to you. You've got those 60 minutes, do with them what you see. But the learning should be active, and the student should be actively involved in each of the 5 E's. Yes, you are offering different levels of support. You may start off with a lot of you talking and them responding to that, but eventually you're responding to them talking. Eventually you're watching from the side. So your key role in most of this is to ask questions and provide some answers, rather than you simply saying, here's what I said, did you listen? Do you guys get that? You want to move away from those, that classic, so what do you guys know about this, after what I've said? So how does this look in a lesson plan? As we said, they can't be collapsed together. Then don't simply replace intro, body, conclusion. They're not verbs. So you don't say stuff like, oh, well, engage students in an exploration of, and then explain, like, don't do that. If you do that, I will immediately think you've not engaged with the materials. It is a great way to get a low mark if that's what you're going for. I hope you're not. Engage and evaluate phases are fairly self-explanatory, but remember to expand your thinking with that. Open and guided discovery can really help with the explore phase. We'll talk more about those in the future. Avoid just transmitting and going, look, here's what it all meant. Don't do that alone. Have some form of dialogue, some form of interaction. Usually the elaborate phase should flow naturally from the explain phase, as students wanting to know more about, or what if we change this, or what if this variable were addressed, what have we considered? It's that sort of stuff where they realise the limitations of the earlier learning. And remember, not every lesson is going to be filled with experiments. Sometimes you've got to discuss things, you've got to draw things, you've got to reflect on things. Sometimes you're talking, they're talking. It's not just about fun activities. You need opportunities to consolidate the knowledge through constructivism, which means language, discussion, writing, drawing. It can't just be experiment. Can't work that way. It can't just be Questacon. I love Questacon. It's serving a very important role for engagement, but they need that time to really sit and think and discuss. And Questacon doesn't allow that. It can't. It's just like crazy fun. They're engaged and they're picking things up. But you need to give time for language. You really do. So what do we know about learning? Well, we can't teach everyone the same way. Now, there are some baseline assumptions about learning. We're not going to get into learning styles, but there are preferences for engagement. But everyone's going to have to read and write at some point. We know that. We do want to look at if preferences. It's not styles, but it's preferences. You can have a preference. I know the learning styles doesn't have a lot of science behind it, but you can have preference for how you like to engage. We all do. We all do. Cultural backgrounds, individual learners, their contexts, all that sort of stuff. It's a bit like online learning. A lot of people like to listen to lectures instead of modules because they don't have the time. And they take steps and they find their own way through things to see what's working. It's the same thing in a primary classroom. The brain is a pattern-seeking organ, constantly searching for order in the chaos. And we want to tap into that. And learning is non-linear. It takes it stalls out. It is rapid. Students can take different pathways through things. They can surprise you. You can throw a lesson plan out the window and find a better idea in the moment. It is built upon scaffolding and bridging them, as we've talked about. And that teaching and assessment should be completely integrated in the process. You're always collecting diagnostic, formative and summative data. Unless you block your ears and close your eyes, you're definitely collecting some form of data. You're definitely looking at the lesson and being a part of it. So people perform better when they know the goal, see the model, and they know how to compare their performance to a standard. They know what they're there to do. There's a big idea. There's something they're striving towards. I mean, how would you feel if I didn't describe the assessment to you? It was just a trust me, or there was no rubric. It would cause you to be insecure in the process. Great variety of styles, attention spans, intelligences, whatever you want to say in how that's expressed. Successful learning involves the use of numerous strategies to suit different contexts. We don't do the same lesson all the time. So we want to build that repertoire in this. Motivation, effort and self-esteem affect learning and performance. They just do. They just do. In fact, there is a statistically, if you do an IQ test, and I don't believe in IQ tests, I don't think they measure anything substantial. I don't think there is a way to measure intelligence. We can only measure intelligent acts, which are context dependent, but that's a side note. If you doing an IQ test or any test in the morning and the afternoon are going to produce statistically significant different results. You after a cup of coffee is a different person. So we have to factor these into it. We're not robots. People need to be nurtured. They need to feel supported. They need to feel motivated. And that ebbs and flows. I mean, geez, it ebbs and flows for teachers too. Knowledge is constructed. It doesn't exist outside the mind of a thinking being. So we have to find ways to get it into the minds of students, see how it's interacting, see how it interacts with our understanding. It is a socially constructed exercise ultimately. So this is the activity for tutorials. We'll be doing it whether you like it or not. So brainstorm activities for each of the E's. Now you could maybe divide this up in your group to make it a bit easier, share the load a bit, but think about what you've been planning and see which kind of 5E's activities and lessons you might be thinking about putting together, and be ready to share them. Because we could use a numbered heads together strategy. Your mileage may vary depending on your tutorial and what you're doing on that campus, but we are engaging with this because we have to get this nailed into your units sooner rather than later. So in terms of weekly preparation, 5E's brainstorm will happen. I would recommend before class, even if you jot it down, things that are relevant to your unit as it currently stands. Complete any task set by your group or lecturer. Again, A-star priority there. If, again, my lectures are throwing you off, the modules are there, 2.1 through 2.6. We're starting to move into pedagogy and unit planning in line with this lecture. And of course, bring that 5E's activity as well. It will make things run a lot smoother if you do bring it. It doesn't need to be hugely detailed. It can be on the back of a piece of paper or in your phone, just in the notes section, whatever. Anything you bring will make those tutorials more beneficial. Even if it's a bit of thought beats none at all. But anyway, that's it from me for this week. And tune in for the week 4 lecture next week.